My name is Stan Chu Ilo. I'm a research professor at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, the organizers of this evening. And on behalf of our director, who is not here, unavoidably absent, Professor Bill Kavanaugh, and Michael Bode, the other research professor at our center, I welcome all of you here to what promises to be a very engaging and enriching evening. And I'd just like to introduce to you some of our staff, people who make these things happen. We have Karen Kraft, who's our managing editor and communication director. She does a lot of other things besides that. And we have Anna, who is our student worker, as well as Elijah. So that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So these are the hidden hands that get the ball rolling here. And we are honored today also in our midst. Before I introduce our speaker for the evening, we are honored here by the presence of Patricia Maza Pittsford, the Consulate General of El Salvador and Dean of the Consular Corps of Chicago. And we recognize all of you here, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for the evening, Andrew McKinley, who was born here in the United States but has lived most of his life in the developing world. He worked in education and rural development in Africa for 4 years, in West Africa, that's Liberia, just a country neighbors to my home country of Nigeria. In 1977, he moved to Central America, where he has resided since. His work there has focused on issues related to social justice, human rights, and sustainable development. He holds a master's degree in health administration, and over the last 15 years has specialized in the struggle for the environment. He currently works in San Salvador as a specialist in mining and water at the Central American Jose Simeon Cañas University, better known as the UCA. He coordinated and co-authored The Water Crisis in El Salvador, Facts and Challenges, published in Spanish last year by UCA Editores. He also has published over 20 articles in national and international media on water and mining. And I've read a little bit about you, Andres, and your interview with Salt and Light, how you articulated the ecological crisis of our times in the spirit of Laudato Si. So here is a man who has the passion for what he does and who has developed a wealth of knowledge and expertise based on this sacrificial work that you do. It is my pleasure and joy to present to you Andrew McKinley.
Good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the DePaul University for inviting me to come up here and speak about an issue that for us living in El Salvador is an issue of life or death. It's not just one more economic or social issue to us. It's a question of life and death in terms of the long-term viability of El Salvador as a country, in terms of the future options for the younger generation or the generations that will come for El Salvador. It will define whether or not those generations have real options to make livelihoods, build livelihoods, meaningful, dignified livelihoods in El Salvador, or whether their only option will be, as it is for so many youth in Central America today, pack your bag and head north. Again, I thank you very much for coming. If it's okay with you, I'm going to sit down for this talk because I'm going to be talking for about 8 hours. I'm not joking. I loved motorcycles when I was young, and I crashed a motorcycle several years ago and broke my back. If there are any of you out there who have that love for motorcycles, take my word for it and stay away from them. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun, but you pay a high cost. So if it's okay with you, I'll just sit and we can be more relaxed in this presentation. What I hope to do, can you all see me?
Yes.
What I hope to do tonight is explain to you a little bit more about why we take such a dramatic approach, why we use this dramatic language when we talk about environmental issues in general and specific themes like mining in a place for El Salvador. And why we have assumed such a radical position against mining in El Salvador. I hope also to be able to explain to you a little bit about what our strategies and what our struggle looked like, what were the key reasons for its success, and also the key role that the Catholic Church played in this struggle from day one. My story begins 500 years ago. When you talk to Central Americans and ask them to explain some very simple phenomena to you that's happening today, they always have to begin 500 years ago with the conquista. But there's truth in that, and this story begins also with King Ferdinand of Spain when he was sitting down with his men defining the priorities for the conquest of the New World. He laid out the #1 priority when he said to his men, go and bring back the gold. He said, do it humanely if you can, but at all costs, bring back the gold. Now, 500 years later, we have transnational mining companies circling the world in search of the last remaining deposits of gold and silver, following in the footsteps of the Spanish conquistadores. In the case of El Salvador, they're hoping to mine a mineral belt that extends from Costa Rica into Nicaragua. It reaches out into the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, then moves up into Honduras, crosses the northern part of El Salvador, and ends up in the western highlands of Guatemala. These mining companies come with an effort to win hearts and souls of communities nearby potential mining sites. And they come with promises, for example, of a new technology in the mining industry that protects the environment. They frequently use terms like green mining, or modern mining, or responsible mining, to give us the impression that there's something new today that allows the extraction and processing of gold and silver in a more harmonious way with the environment. They also promise jobs and economic boom at the local level, and they're making this promise to communities in dire need of employment and economic boom. They promise income to governments for national development, especially in the areas of healthcare, education, public security, and other priorities that countries in Central America have. And finally, they recognize the abuse of human rights that has been associated with transnational mining initiatives in the past, but they assure us all that they're aware now of the importance of respecting human rights and promise that mining initiatives today will respect the human rights, especially of nearby communities. But the people in El Salvador, in spite of all of these promises, said no. According to polls done by the UCA in 2015, the UCA is the university where I work, polls indicated that almost 80% of the Salvadoran population considered El Salvador to be an inappropriate place to do mining. 76% of the population polled were opposed to opening mining projects in their municipality, and many of these municipalities, as I mentioned a minute ago, are municipalities in dire need of generating employment opportunities. 77% of the population poll considered that the government of El Salvador should take immediate steps to prohibit this industry. Why such a radical view, in spite of such an attractive offer on the part of transnational corporations? How do we explain the fact that Salvadorans were so adamant in saying no? The reason, or the answer to this question, can be synthesized in a single word: water. El Salvador is a country that suffers from a profound water crisis in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, and in terms of access. Our rivers and lakes are drying up. There have been studies done in the past couple of years that indicate that of the 360 most important rivers in El Salvador, all but one have lost between 30 and 70% of their water level, their water flow, over the past 20 years. And when you travel into the countryside, you can see this phenomena visually, without the studies, without the experts. Now, there are areas in the country where I've been traveling for the past 40 years, and some of those areas were areas that in rainy season I ran the risk of being trapped between two raging rivers, and that's no longer the case. The rivers that I confront today in that same rural area, they look like the rivers that I'm showing you in this video. Also, key aquifers are being depleted. According to the Ministry of Natural Resources, the water tables in various areas of El Salvador, the most strategic aquifers in the country, are going down between 0.5 meter and 1 meter per year, generating increasing areas of desertification, rendering the country less resistant to climate change and to other extreme weather phenomena like droughts. And finally, according again to the Ministry of Natural Resources, over 90% of surface waters are polluted. When you combine all of these phenomena in El Salvador, you end up with a country that's considered by most international experts to have the lowest availability of freshwater resources per person per year in Central America. You can see here in this chart developed by the Global Water Partnership, countries like Belize have almost 65,000 cubic meters of water per person per year, Panama with 52,000, Nicaragua with almost 39,000, for El Salvador with somewhere between 1,750 and 3,000 cubic meters of water per person, depending on which expert you're talking to. When we talk about having available water supplies of 1,750 cubic meters of water, we're talking about being on the verge of water stress. Water stress is a situation in which countries or regions have inadequate supply of fresh water to meet the demands of the population. And as you can see, El Salvador is right on the doorstep of having a situation of water stress. Metallic mining has an enormous impact on water. Metallic mining utilizes enormous quantities of water. Water is the life force of metallic mining. You can't do mining without water, especially gold mining and silver mining. As you know, water is also the life force for human life, human well-being. So we have a situation in which an industry like gold mining is competing with human life for this resource so essential that is water. The average gold mine in Central America utilizes over 1 million liters of water per day. Some of the gold mines, there's one, for example, in northern Guatemala, excuse me, the Marlin mine, which according to the owners of that mine utilizes over 6 million liters of water per day. There are gold mines around the world that use over 350 million liters of water per day. The point is, gold mining, silver mining, metal mining in general utilizes enormous quantities of water. That's obviously a problem for a country that's on the verge of water stress. Metallic mining also contaminates water. Gold mining uses a toxic chemical called sodium cyanide to remove the gold from the ore. Once the rock and the ore is removed from the soil, it's mixed with a mixture of water and sodium cyanide to remove the gold. Sodium cyanide is a toxic chemical that can kill a human being in quantities less than a grain of rice. And mining companies in Central America utilize thousands of gallons of cyanide mixed with water every day. And it's not only at the mine site that cyanide is a risk. Cyanide has to go through ports. It has to be transported where trucks can tip over. And there are a number of cases of serious cyanide spills in countries around Central America, putting human life in danger. But the most serious concern that we have about water contamination through mining is a phenomenon called acid mine drainage. It's a phenomenon that contaminates water with sulfuric acid, with heavy metals, and with other substances that are toxic to human and aquatic life. And once it begins in a river, this is a picture of a river in the eastern part of El Salvador, the San Sebastian River. Once it begins in a river, it's almost impossible to reverse. They're finding old gold mines in Spain and France from the times of the Roman Empire that are still generating acid mine drainage. Even in countries like the United States, where you would expect to have stronger regulatory bodies in operation, according to a study done in 2013 by Earthworks, mines were contaminating 27 billion gallons of fresh water each year in the United States. And the cost of treatment was $67 billion a year forever. This is obviously a cost that no developing country would be able to make in an effort to recuperate its sources of fresh water. There are other reasons for saying no to metallic mining as well. In El Salvador, we learned the lessons from emblematic mining cases around Central America and around the world. When the mining struggle started in El Salvador, I was working with Oxfam America, and I was the coordinator for their extractive industries program in Central America. That gave me the opportunity to travel to communities in all of the countries of Central America and witness firsthand the impact of metallic mining in those countries. It also gave me the opportunity to travel to places like Ghana and Mali, Senegal, Liberia, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and even Nevada, and in the United States, and witness firsthand the impact, the negative impacts of metallic mining. But we don't have to go far to learn the lessons about metallic mining. There's an abundance of emblematic cases in Central America that give us these lessons. We learned, for example, that mining does not promote an economic boom in local communities, but rather promotes poverty. We learned that in communities like Bonanza, Nicaragua, where gold mining has been going on for over 100 years, yet over 80% of the population there lives in absolute poverty. We learned that mining continues to violate human rights, from Mayan women in the western highlands of Guatemala suffering from the destruction of their housing as a result of the vibrations of heavy mining equipment and from the explosions of dynamite utilized to break open the rock when they're mining. We learned that mining is a danger to health from children and from women in the Syria Valley in Honduras, where only 9 years of metallic mining, gold mining, contaminated the waters to a degree that it generated a high incidence of skin disease, generated problems with kidney failure. I had teachers explain to me how children in first grade demonstrated a gradual process of loss of intellectual capacity as a result of contamination from lead. We learned from the Lenca people of Honduras who were struggling, saying no to metallic mining in their territories, and were met with extreme violence from their own security forces. And we learned of the violation of metallic mining companies from the Mayan Quechua of Guatemala, who were forcefully kicked off their lands where they had inhabited for hundreds of years in order to make way for mining operations. In the words of Darío Bossi, who is the founder of a network of churches and mining in Latin America, large mining projects are presented in our countries as the solution to poverty and underdevelopment for our communities. Nevertheless, it is impossible to find in Latin America a single community that has overcome poverty or significantly improved development indicators after mining was installed in its territories. Quite to the contrary, along with more profound levels of poverty, contamination, and the destruction of traditional forms of community life, we find signs of social and moral degradation, violence, and the corruption of authorities and communal leaders. The anti-mining struggle in El Salvador lasted 17 years. We often talk about a struggle of 12 years, but the truth is the struggle it became national in 2005 and lasted for approximately 12 years. But several years before that, individual communities who were watching the incursion of transnational mining companies into their territories had begun to resist and begun to protest gold mining in their communities. Like I mentioned, from 2005 to 2009, we built a national struggle based on public policy advocacy. We built a broad national coalition called the National Roundtable on Mining, made up of environmental NGOs, community-based organizations, legal aid organizations, churches, and other sectors of the society, which became the backbone of the struggle in El Salvador for many years. And then in 2009, we won a de facto moratorium. It wasn't actually a formal legal legislative measure that made it illegal to mine in El Salvador, but rather a promise of a presidential candidate and then 2 consecutive presidential candidates that their administration would not approve any permits to explore or exploit gold or silver in El Salvador. This de facto moratorium in El Salvador obviously was a worry to transnational corporations. They felt threatened by the situation, and 2 of those corporations filed suit against the Salvadoran government in the International Center for the Resolution of Investment Disputes of the World Bank in Washington. And they filed these suits based on a clause in free trade agreements that stipulates that transnational corporations can sue governments whenever those governments try to implement public policies that will have a negative impact on the future profits of those transnational corporations. So in other words, a country like El Salvador and a government like the government of El Salvador who wants to protect its water and wants to institute public policy that defends water against the danger and the threat of metallic mining can be sued by transnational corporations in this International Center for the Resolution of Investment Disputes. And these disputes went on for 7 years. They were finally decided in favor of El Salvador in 2016, and what followed was a modification in the correlation of forces within El Salvador with the victory in CWCIT against transnational mining corporations. The correlation began to change in our favor in El Salvador, and we initiated the final phase of our struggle with the definitive battle for prohibition. There are a number of key characteristics that it's important to mention when we talk about our struggle in El Salvador, and they have a lot to do with the reason why we were ultimately successful in that struggle. Number one, our struggle was a struggle of nonviolence. You have to remember that El Salvador is a country that suffered from 50 years of military dictatorship, followed by 12 years of bloody civil war, and resulting in a country that is still highly polarized, politically speaking. We did not want our struggle against mining to follow the path of the traditional ways of doing politics in El Salvador, so we're adamantly nonviolent. Our struggles were much more struggles of ideas than they were struggles of brute force. We believed wholeheartedly in truth. We believed that a grain of truth could overcome a highly funded, aggressive propaganda campaigns of transnational corporations filled with lies about the benefits of gold mining in El Salvador. And we held this nonviolent stance even in the face of repression against anti-mining activists. In 2009, for example, 4 anti-mining activists were killed by pro-mining forces in the country, and in 2011, a 5th activist was killed by pro-mining forces. The second important characteristic of our struggle was the linkage of local community resistance to national advocacy campaigns. Our struggle consisted of local struggles of communities saying no to mining. At the same time, we were building a broad national struggle built on the logic of public policy advocacy. That's a recognition of the fact that local struggles are important for national struggles. You can't hope to be successful at the national level if you're not incorporating the aspirations and the struggles of people in local communities. But at the same time, the struggles at the level of local communities are difficult to sustain if they're not intimately linked in to a broader national process of public policy advocacy. Thirdly, our struggle was based or had a strong emphasis on empowerment. We were doing public policy advocacy campaigns, and we saw advocacy as an exercise in power. In other words, we knew that if we were going to influence the powers that be, in El Salvador around issues related to mining, we had to be more powerful ourselves. And empowerment for us had very precise meanings. Empowerment meant organizing. It meant building unity. It meant building alliances. It meant assuring effective democratic leadership. It meant gender equity. It meant having human and economic resources. It meant building technical capacity in a number of different areas, including the ability to analyze and utilize information, the ability to generate information through research, the ability to formulate clear proposals. We weren't just out in the street yelling no to metallic mining. We were developing clear proposals for the prohibition at the national level of metallic mining. It meant building the capacity to plan, to negotiate, and so many other different capacities that we had to take into consideration. Fourthly, our struggle applied the logic of public policy advocacy. Again, looking at public policy advocacy as a nonviolent process to influence decision makers with clear proposals. Like I just mentioned, we were not in the streets with political consignas, is the word in Spanish, with political phrases or demands against mining. We were in the streets demanding that the National Assembly approve our proposals for prohibition of metallic mining in El Salvador. And fifthly, our struggle utilized a broad variety of strategies. We weren't just in the street. We were organizing and building alliances. We were educating, building awareness. We were doing research and distributing that research. We were lobbying. We were working with media, with communication strategies, and of course we were mobilizing. That meant going into the communities, educating those communities about the threat of metallic mining in a country like El Salvador, and helping to organize those communities. It meant building alliances with international actors. We built strategic alliances with actors in the United States, with actors in Canada, where the mining companies were coming from, with actors in Australia, with actors in the Philippines, and from other countries around the world. It meant giving consistently public forums to educate public opinion and educate different sectors of the society on the threat of metallic mining for El Salvador. It meant developing educational materials and disseminating those materials widely. It meant lobbying public functionaries and policy decision makers, including the president and his closest advisors. It meant accompanying deputies from all political spectrums to sites where mining had taken place in the past in El Salvador, so that they could see with their own eyes the damage that metallic mining had already brought to El Salvador. It meant working with media and doing press conferences. It meant working with media for radio interviews, television interviews. It meant holding concentrations of people at the World Trade Center in San Salvador, pushing for a just finding in the legal cases brought against El Salvador. It meant support for municipalities that wanted to give a voice to the inhabitants of those municipalities threatened by mining through popular consultations. And of course it meant being in the street, having a presence in the street, demonstrating social force. The Catholic Church played a special role in our struggle from the very beginning. The Catholic Church has enormous power to influence in El Salvador, in large part because of its morality and sense of ethics, its enormous credibility with the population, and because of its long and faithful history of accompaniment, especially of the poor. The Catholic Church understood metallic mining as a threat to God's creation, and understood that our planet had been put into our hands to care for and to defend for the generations present today, and for so many generations to come who at this moment have no voice, they have no vote on these issues that we're talking about. And so the Catholic Church saw as part of their commitment defending the rights of those generations yet to come. The Catholic bishop in the department of Chalatenango, very early on in the struggle, approximately in 2000, came out strongly against metallic mining in the province. In 2007, the Conference of Catholic Bishops produced the document that they called Taking Care of Our Common Home, Cuidemos la Casa de Todos in Spanish, in which they clearly put forth the formal position of the Catholic Church in El Salvador against metallic mining. The Archbishop of El Salvador, when the struggle began, was a Spaniard, very conservative, named Sáenz Lacalle, who came out strongly against mining because he had a chemistry background, and he understood very clearly the dangers of cyanide poisoning to the waters of El Salvador. His successor, Archbishop Escobar Alas, followed his footsteps with the same analysis. And in February of 2009, following presidential elections, in a meeting of the three presidents of three branches of government, said to the outgoing as well as the incoming government that they should prohibit metallic mining in El Salvador. And Monsignor Escobar Alas has been consistent in his message against metallic mining, with press conferences every week at the end of Sunday Mass. Cardinal Rosa Chavez also has been highly outspoken against metallic mining, as has been the Pope. The Pope has been a major ally of ours in our struggle against mining in El Salvador because of the international events that he has organized and generated in Rome, bringing social activists from all over the world to meet and analyze and discuss, organize around environmental issues, and of course from his encyclical Laudato Si, which is a call to all of us to defend natural resources, defend the creation of God. The shirt that he's holding up right now says, "Water is worth more than gold." The UCA, where I worked, played its role as an academic institution. It did what academic institutions should do. It did research on the impacts of mining. It produced publications. It did opinion polls and disseminated the results of those opinion polls. It held frequent international forums to highlight the threat of metallic mining in a country like El Salvador. It joined up with Caritas El Salvador and with Catholic Relief Services to work with the media, trying to educate public opinion. We held public debates against mining companies in El Salvador. And in 2016, the UCA analyzed that 10 years had gone by since the presentation to the National Assembly of the first proposal for prohibition of metallic mining. That proposal was presented in 2006 by the National Roundtable on Mining. Another second proposal was presented in 2013, but right-wing parties refused to debate the issue. So in 2016, the UCA decided that we're going to develop our own the proposed bill to prohibit metallic mining in El Salvador. And we utilized the services of lawyers from our Department of Juridical Sciences to develop a strong proposal that was later brought to the Archbishop of San Salvador. He liked this proposal very much. He took it on as his own, and our proposal became the official proposal of the Catholic Church against metallic mining. And we carried that proposal together, UCA and the Catholic Church hierarchy, to the National Assembly on February 6th of 2017. And it was presented to representatives of all of the political parties in the National Assembly. We requested and received invitations to have audiences with the Commission on Environment in El Salvador to try to educate them more on the threat of metallic mining for a country like El Salvador. We participated with the Franciscan Order, who has always been adamant activists against violations against the environment in El Salvador. And in early March, 1 month after we had presented our proposal for prohibition, there has still been a little movement in the National Assembly towards approval. So Archbishop Escobar decided to hold a march. And this is the first example that I can think of in the years that I've lived in El Salvador in which the church as a whole took to the streets. And we mobilized about 6,000 priests and nuns, lay people from the parishes, people opposed to metallic mining, social movements, the National Roundtable against mining participated as well. And we marched to the National Assembly and presented a document demanding that the Commission of Environment advance in the discussion on our proposal for prohibition. The President of the National Assembly promised us, he was taken a bit by surprise, and he promised us in front of about 60 or 70 different public media that the National Assembly would move on our proposal, and he expected that they could have it approved within 2 weeks, before Holy Week. The correlation at that moment, the correlation of forces in El Salvador, as I mentioned earlier, was changing dramatically in our favor. We began to feel that there are conditions in El Salvador to win this victory. And of course, that was a great worry to transnational corporations. Transnational mining corporations, especially Pacific Rim and their new owners, Oceanic Gold from Australia, began to perceive that this thing was getting out of their hands and that the people of El Salvador might actually carry this victory in the struggle against metallic mining. So they launched a highly aggressive media campaign with written media, with television media, with radio media, again using this theme of green mining or responsible mining. And they used as their model for responsible mining a project of Oceanic Gold in the province of Nueva Vizcaya in the Philippines. They were holding this out to El Salvador as a model of responsible mining that could happen in El Salvador. In the UCA, we started searching for ways to get in touch with the governor of Nueva Vizcaya in the Philippines, and we found him and invited him to come to El Salvador for a week of intensive activities, including press conferences, meetings with communities, meetings with the president of El Salvador, meetings with the Commission on Environment, etc., etc., etc. And he was very effective. He especially in the Commission of Environment, because the governor of Nueva Vizcaya had been a deputy for 25 years in the Philippines. So he knew how to talk to his fellow deputies, and they believed him when he spoke. I remember his final words to the deputies in the Commission on Environment were, "You can avoid all the problems that we've had with mining in the Philippines by approving a bill to prohibit metallic mining in El Salvador." And that afternoon, that's exactly what the Commission did. They approved our that's the way we felt. They approved our bill to prohibit metallic mining. The next day it was sent to the plenary session of the National Assembly, where it was approved with a vote count of 69 in favor and 0 votes against. There was one deputy from a right-wing party who had not been present during the voting, and he called in his vote in favor of approval, so the final count was 70-0. Obviously, we all went berserk with that. It was a victory that had taken us, some of us 12 years, some of us 17 years to get. It was a very frustrating process. There were so many times when it just looked impossible. Those kinds of gains are not easy to get when you have a strong private sector. For example, in the case of El Salvador, many of whom were interested in investing in metallic mining, so we have very powerful opponents. We had strong right-wing parties who in the beginning were not even willing to debate the issue, but we finally were able to, over this period of years, through a process of accumulated force, accumulated knowledge, accumulated enlightenment, accumulated organization, social organization, we're able to change the correlation of forces in our favor and win this battle. Winning this victory in El Salvador made El Salvador the first country in the world to prohibit metallic mining. And this is a great thing for a country like El Salvador. El Salvador is a wonderful country. I can tell you from my personal experience living there, but it's a country that suffers from a number of very negative superlatives. Yes. Many people consider El Salvador to be the most violent country in the world. You hear that the environmental levels of environmental deterioration of El Salvador, this most highly dense, has the most dense population in the Western Hemisphere, etc., etc., etc. But now we have this enormous sense of pride in El Salvador at being the first country in the world to analyze critically the benefits versus the costs of metallic mining and exercise the sovereign rights to say no. Our struggle today is on defending that law. Mining corporations around the world obviously are not happy with our victory. They're determined to overthrow it, not so much because of the gold that they lost in El Salvador, but because of the precedent that is established by this small nation, its capacity to motivate other countries around the world, to motivate other communities who are confronting the violation of their rights from transnational mining companies to organize and mobilize around this issue. Our struggle today, I'll end by saying, is now besides defending the full application of our anti-mining law, of our law on prohibition, we are struggling now to get a strong, effective a law on the books to regulate water in El Salvador. As I mentioned, water was at the bottom. It's the basic issue in our struggle against metallic mining. And El Salvador, although it's a country that suffers from this profound water crisis, it does not have adequate legislation to guarantee the defense and protection and sustainable use of water. It does not have the institutionality in place to guarantee effective regulation of water. So that's our current struggle now. So I'll leave you with that final thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres. And the floor is now open for questions. And if you want to ask a question, we ask you to come up to the microphone and make your question very short and straight to the point, because I guess there are so many people here who are also willing to ask questions, so we want to give everyone the opportunity.
Well, I am happy because I am the first in the line for the first time. Professor, thank you so much for your presentation. It was great, really. And my question is, what do you think about a connection between, for example, this organization in El Salvador, and that I can see is from down, really, because I saw the picture and I saw that was not the academic people, not the students, if not really el pueblo, no? We call the people to the poor people from down, of course, with the political person working or research like you. But what do you think about a connection to do a network between different movements in the region in Latin America, pushing from down to up the beginning of the process about this transition, this way, this transformation? Do you know if they are in connection, or if this is possible, or from the government or from the power stop that connection? Thank you.
You can answer, Andres, if you want to take each question.
Yeah, I would like to respond one by one if I could. Yeah, because I'm an old man and I have a hard time remembering. Central America is a highly politicized region. So people are very political and very interested in organizing around any issue. Anytime you bring people together in El Salvador, for example, to discuss a shared problem, you're going to end up with an organization, some minimal. The first thing people will say is, organization, we have to organize. And I'll say also that for many of us, of course, we were completely focused on the threat of metallic mining at that moment in El Salvador. But we're keenly aware of the fact that El Salvador has many problems that have to be resolved. The signing of peace in 91, 92 didn't resolve all of the problems confronting El Salvador. So we need to be thinking constantly in this idea of empowerment. How do we empower ourselves to resolve not only the issues of environment, but also other more difficult, maybe, more complex issues confronting El Salvador. And not only confronting El Salvador, but confronting us at a regional level. And not only at a regional level. Look at the increasing number of problems that are beginning to confront us at a much broader level. We can even talk more and more today about the problems that confront humanity. Yeah, So, you know, many of us, I'm not saying everyone in the struggle, but many of us had what I would consider a very strategic vision related to our struggle against mining. We saw this as one of many. We need to build organization around the ban of mining so that we can have an organization to fight social injustice in many other areas. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense, but so we see a anti-mining struggle as a way of preparing us politically, socially, in human terms, in terms of our knowledge, the knowledge we have about different themes, the knowledge we have about how government works, how do you influence effectively in government. You know, we're preparing ourselves to be able to deal effectively with all of these other problems as well. It's a little bit related to what we were talking about earlier, you know. How do we really change this world? You know, I love this saying, you know, a different world is possible. There are alternatives. There are different ways of building an economy, of building a society, of interrelating between peoples or interrelating between countries. There are different models we can use for our development. We don't have to depend on extractivism. We're not locked into neoliberal principles. There are new, different alternatives out there, but to be able to attain those, we need to be able to empower ourselves more. And that means building relationships, not only within a country, but much beyond the country, beyond regions that are confronting similar problems as we are.
First of all, Andres, thank you for caring so much. And I guess you're more Salvadorian than a lot of Salvadorians. So thank you for caring. Bueno. And one of the things that I'm curious, because you know, it seems that it's all international companies, multinational companies. So how did they get the rights to exploit, you know, minerals in El Salvador and in Central America? That's first thing. And second thing is, have you had any requests or, you know, knocking on the doors from other countries to share the experience? How is that working?
Okay. First of all, how do transnational mining companies show up at the doorstep in a country like El Salvador and feel the right to exploit gold and silver? You know, there's a joke that we used to tell about transnational corporations who would come down to Central America and ask themselves, how did our gold get under their soil? But, you know, the problem in the case of El Salvador was El Salvador had a mining law in place. And that mining law, it was passed in 1998. That mining law, it required the government to foment metallic mining. It states clearly in the mining law, it's the obligation of the Ministry of Economy, and they have a direction of mining and hydrocarbons, and it is their mandate to foment metallic mining. So it was very easy for transnational mining companies to come to El Salvador in a particular period and get licenses. Much of it has to do with the ignorance that existed in El Salvador related to mining. El Salvador does not have a strong history of mining. There are no mining engineers in El Salvador. There are few people who really knew much about mining. That's why one of our first tasks for those of us who began to smell something bad about mining was research. and get to know these emblematic cases of mining around the world and find out, you know, what is this phenomenon of metallic mining, what does it really mean for a country like El Salvador? And then to begin to transfer that knowledge to communities and organizations and citizens and policy decision makers. In the early days of the struggle, we had many meetings with the Ministry of Economy. They didn't know anything about mining. We knew more about mining than they did. And we brought mining engineers from Spain and from other countries. And we got meetings with them, with the Ministry of Economy, to educate not only the people, because that's number one, you know, educate the communities is number one. Educate the general citizenry as well, but also educate policymakers, you know, educate decision makers. Many wrong policy decisions have to do with the lack of adequate information. It's not always a problem of political will. Sometimes it's a problem of political will. I know, but I don't care. I'm going this way, even though we should go this way. That's political will. But oftentimes it was a question of ignorance. And I'm convinced that, you know, much of the gains that we won in terms of changing the correlation of forces in Salvadoran society against metallic mining had to do with educational efforts. We sent people in communities that were threatened by mining to go to Honduras and see a real mine. Or we sent them to go to San Miguel Ixtuacan in the western highlands of Guatemala, to see what a real mine is doing to the populations there. You know, don't just believe us. Here's the information, but don't believe us. We're going to send you to San Miguel Ixtuacan. So you know, it was this process of constant building and accumulation. And the second question is
it's have you been you know, reached by other countries or communities to
yes,
to assist them in organizing?
Yes. You know, the National Roundtable Against Mining has relationships at a very global level. I'm not going to say all over the world, but with many developing countries, especially Latin American countries. And there's ongoing communication. There's a regional alliance, an anti-mining alliance of countries from Panama to Mexico. And there are broader alliances that people are trying to build. We're in communication with the countries like the Philippines that's suffering a lot from metallic mining and making the same offer. You know, you came to help us at a very key moment in our struggle. We're willing to come and help you in your struggle. So, you know, there's these kinds of information exchanges, efforts to organize broadly around mining issues that are going on. Of course, you know, we're doing right now in the UCA a case study of these struggles, because we want to be able to share that as well with communities being confronted with transnational mining corporations.
I also wanted to thank you for a wonderful talk, as the Council General did. I'm curious as to whether you have any opinion as to the new government and whether they'll be supportive in environmental issues or this issue.
Who is my government? I'm a lost soul.
I know. I know.
Are you referring to the Salvador?
No, I'm not referring to this one. Absolutely not. I don't think there's any sympathy there. No, the new government in El Salvador.
Yeah. There's a lot that could be said about that. I don't want to get into it too much, because the new president who has been elected in El Salvador is, for most of us, an unknown quantity. He has not been very verbal or outgoing with his vision for El Salvador. However, he has made comments that are hopeful, are hope-inspiring, related to water, for example. You know, our battle on water in El Salvador is to try to assure that that we end up with public, state-run regulatory institutions that are managing water. We're confronting large business enterprises that want to be in the decision-making process around water because they want to prioritize, they want to assure the interest of big business in water management. Yeah, I understand that logic, but there's no country in the world really that has placed its water in the hands of the private sector, hoping to get, you know, effective, equitable, sustainable management of water. So that's our battle on water, and I forget where else I was going with that.
So you don't know, I mean, he hasn't really been very outspoken, is
exactly,
what I've read too.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's where I was going. So, you know, Nayib Bukele has come out saying he believes that water has to be managed by public state institutions. And so we're hopeful, you know, that he's going to be very much in line with our thinking about the institutional structures for managing water in El Salvador. But like I say, he hasn't been verbal. I don't think he's held any press conferences to really tell the people of El Salvador about his vision and where he wants to take the country. So
they were motivated to vote for
it's
him.
hard, yeah.
Sorry. Okay, that's enough.
Okay.
Is it known if the water crisis in El Salvador is due to climate change?
It's related to climate change. When you talk about, for example, the water table going down so dramatically, that has a lot to do with climate change. However, it also has a lot to do with abuse. And here, that takes us back to big business again. I'll just give you a few examples. There's a transnational corporation that produces beer and sodas in El Salvador, and they also bottle Coca-Cola, called SABMiller. And they are draining one of the most strategic aquifers in El Salvador. It's an aquifer that supplies almost half of the drinking water to the population of San Salvador, the capital city. Experts calculate that at the rate that water is being extracted from that aquifer right now, it will last probably another 30 years, maybe 25 to 30 years, and it will be dry. And what people will drink in San Salvador, I don't know. The people in the municipality of Nejapa, which is where this aquifer is located, are already suffering from lack of water. People in that area receive water only 2 or 3 times a week, while the Coca-Cola bottling company exports over 100,000 cartons of Coca-Cola daily. We have other examples of, you know, big business, sugarcane producers, for example. Sugarcane is a growing entity in El Salvador, and sugarcane requires, like mining, requires enormous quantities of water, and it frequently leaves the surrounding rural communities without water because there's no one there to regulate the amount of water they're drawing out of the soil. We have other cases where there was one area on the edge of San Salvador. It was an old coffee plantation, but it served as a filter for millions of cubic meters of water, of rainwater per year, which fed another one of the most strategic aquifers of El Salvador, called the San Salvador Aquifer. And big business got hold of that. It had been declared a reserve because it was an area that recharged aquifer. because they were able to maneuver things and got access to that lands to build shopping malls. So we lost that area of filtration. So, I mean, these are examples. That the problem in these examples is not climate change. Climate change certainly has an impact on the water crisis in El Salvador, but there's this enormous man-made impact that something can be done about through good water legislation. Uh-oh.
But I did want to ask a question that gets at something you haven't talked about and that I think is also potentially important, and that's small-scale mining. So I know one of the complexities in El Salvador was not only to try to prohibit the large-scale mining from coming in, but what to do with the small-scale miners that were involved in some of the area where they had historically been mining, and they simply went in without regulation, and of course were involved in the contamination process as well.
Excellent question. When the UCA and the Catholic Church developed our proposal of prohibition, we included all forms of mining, large-scale, industrial, small-scale, artisanal mining, prohibited. One of the right-wing parties in the Commission on Environment, who I suspect has a base, a political base, in the area, in the eastern part of El Salvador, where artisanal mining has been traditionally carried out for generations. They insisted that we open the door to a grace period. 2 years, they said. We need to give these artisanal miners 2 years grace period before shutting all their mining operations down. And in order to get our mining ban passed, we didn't put up a fight against that. And so the law that passed with this 2-year open door for 2 years, 2-year grace period for about 350 artisanal miners in the eastern part of El Salvador in a place called San Sebastian, the same place where you saw the Orange River that has been contaminated by acid mine drainage. We celebrated the 2nd anniversary of the passing of our mining ban a few days ago, on the 29th of March. So according to the law, all of those mining activities have to be shut down. The artisanal miners are a very special group. They're independent, they're tough, they're armed, they're organized, they're determined, yeah? And I don't think the government in El Salvador really wants to mess with it. It's our fear. But according to law, the government has to go in there now and close the mines, give them adequate technical closure, and begin to recuperate those areas that have been damaged, recuperate the environmental damage that has been done through mining, and put that prohibition in action. It's a complex issue because even in the days when we were out there arguing, debating, informing, I remember many large events in the eastern part of the country where almost half of the auditorium would be artisanal miners, looking at us like, you know, we're their #1 enemy on the face of this earth. And it hurt. In fact, some of them mobilized against us when I was in Oxfam America, and they put big posters on the front of the building of Oxfam America saying Andrew McKinley out of El Salvador. Andrew McKinley, the enemy of the Salvadoran working class. Wow, that was really well done because that hit home. And you know, I feel great sympathy to these guys. These guys, in my opinion, are not our enemy. They are Salvadoran workers. They're miners, and they have been mining for generations. Their grandparents mined, their fathers mined, and they continue to mine in their own backyard, in their patio. This is not a Canadian mining company who is coming in and stealing the natural resources of El Salvador, so it's complex. It's not an easy issue. And they say, also part of the regulation of our mining ban states that the government of El Salvador has to work with those communities to find alternatives, economic alternatives. But those miners, I've heard them say, you know, don't come to us with projects on shoemaking. We're not shoemakers, we're not tailors, yeah? We're miners. So it's complex, you know. My heart goes out to these guys. On the other hand, we're not going to put in jeopardy 6 million Salvadorans, because El Salvador, as you know, is a small, densely populated population. All the rivers run together. You contaminate one area, you're contaminating the entire country. You're affecting an entire population. We're not going to allow the interest of 350 people to jeopardize the interest of 6 million. But it's a problem, hopefully, that can be dealt with, you know, without the ultimate option is go in there with a police force and capture these. Anyone who's doing mining, you know, legally should be locked up. You know, I would hate to see it come to that, and I don't think that it will. The other danger is that transnational mining companies can utilize that situation in San Sebastian to open the door to the debate on mining again in El Salvador. These miners have come, they've been lobbying Monsignor Escobar Alas, and he's been very firm. I mean, he comes out very firm and saying, the artisanal miners are not our enemy, but just like I'm saying right now, we're not going to jeopardize the health and well-being of the vast majority of the population just in order to accommodate this small sector. There's also the risk, you know, there were about 15, in the mid-20th century, there were about 15 other mid-scale mining operations going on around the country. There has to be gold and silver deposits in those areas. So one of the fears that many of us have always had is that, you know, artisanal mining can spread like plague. There's no work in El Salvador. I mean, the economic situation for, you know, people is dire, difficult, and mining is always there. It's always an option. And very quickly, this artisanal mining phenomenon that we see located only in the eastern part of the country right now could spread to the national level. So most of us are quite adamant about, you know, closing the door to that initiative in El Salvador. Are you in agreement with that, Rose?
I'm listening to you. I follow your lead.
I want your opinion.
No, I actually am in agreement. Christy and I were in Peru with a group of students, and we spent a lot of time working with small miners and talking with them about their struggles. It's the same kind of issue. You do feel sympathy for them.
Yeah, yeah.
But
These
they
are
aren't
hard-working guys. They're not crooks. They're not asking for anything. You know, they're tough, hard. They go down in these little holes that you can't stand up in, and some of them go 100 meters into the earth, and they're down there. You know, El Salvador is a country highly vulnerable to earthquakes and flooding. Any moment, you know, those tunnels could come down. They're poorly built. I mean, these guys are. I have enormous admiration for our artisanal miners, and I've known some tough women, artisanal miners with pistols on the hip, and who are, you know, defending their right to be there mining, you know, minerals in a particular location. So it's a very complex issue.
Yeah, thank you, Andres. And,